Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers landform contexts and histories. By the end of this episode, you will be able to describe landforms in terms of their larger settings and their changing conditions. You can interpret how people used those settings in the past and adjusted with them through time. You can think of a landform as a unit of terrain with overall similar geology that can be distinguished from its adjacent areas. In this view, landform context refers to the situation and surroundings. Landform history refers to the context changing through a chronological sequence. Ideally for archaeological research, you could look at a landform today and ascertain how it looked in the past and how it changed through variable time periods. You could develop hypotheses about how people may have lived in those settings, and you can search for archaeological evidence to test your hypotheses. This presentation concentrates on landforms as material entities that can be studied confidently through durable physical evidence. Additional lines of evidence often can be added for a fuller picture of ancient contexts, but the physical landforms provide a confident starting point. If you can build more knowledge about how landforms take shape and change, then you can strengthen your ability in a broad range of archaeological research. This presentation will illustrate a few examples of slopes, streams or rivers, and seashores as a way to encourage more thought about ancient landform contexts and histories. Slopes occur in many different forms, wherever the terrain involves a gradient or relief. Slopes naturally adjoin other units of land, and they could be recognized with internal portions or subdivisions. In some situations, a slope can be described by its angle, usually measuring the angle from the base corner. This approach works best when the angle of the slope continues evenly over its length. In most real-life settings, a slope varies in its angle over some distance. In those cases, the slope can be measured as a ratio, looking at the total horizontal distance versus the vertical distance. In some studies, a slope is described as a percent. The calculation involves the horizontal distance divided by the vertical distance, then multiplied by 100 and expressed as a percentage. However you describe or define the slope, you should be aware of how the landform originated and how it changed through time into the slope that you can see today. You can start with identifying the physical composition of the geological parent material. Limestone, volcanic formations, and other materials can be affected differently by physical and chemical weathering. The surface can break down into variable results of cavities, slopes, rock particles, and sediments. Through time, the loose rock and sediment on the surface will be affected by erosion and gradually transport down the slope. These smaller particles tend to be more vulnerable to these forces, so they usually comprise the majority of slope-eroded materials redeposited in lower elevations. The larger clasts and rocks tend to remain stationary on a slope, although they can be transported with high-energy episodes of heavy rains or landslides. The angularity of material can affect the extent of abrasive erosion along a slope. More angularity tends to create more abrasion, leading eventually to more irregular or bumpy surface of the underlying slope. Likewise, the contact with more angular ground tends to erode rocks and particles into smaller clasts. After understanding the basic physical properties and mechanics of a sloped landform, you can consider other factors, such as how the local vegetation affected the setting through time. Archaeologists should be aware of the kinds of plants that have grown in an area, noting the extent of their root systems that may have intruded into the ground. Additionally, some kinds of leaf litter can create a thick covering over a forest floor, potentially protecting archaeological deposits to some degree. Certain varieties of leaf litter and fallen fruits could attract animals, such as pigs. Other leaf litter could be highly acidic and diminish the potential for more plant growth. Through time, innumerable trees may have lived and died over an archaeological site. Sometimes a tree will decay and disintegrate into the ground. Other times, a tree will fall and uproot, thereby creating a cavity in the ground and a toss zone of sediments and rocks along with the fallen tree. The tree-tossed sediments through time will create intermixing of a sedimentary matrix, including the archaeological materials as part of that matrix. Concurrently with the plant life, animals can disturb and reshape the ground. For example, crabs and other burrowing animals can create variable sizes, depths, and extents of ground disturbance through sedimentary layers. Other landscape transformations occur with fires, in extreme cases resulting in complete loss of forest cover. After an intense burning, grasses and weeds tend to grow quickly, while trees may need more time to recover. In any case, burning episodes will affect the ground cover, the degree of vulnerability to erosion, and the subsequent nutrients in the topsoil. Depending on the natural environment and the cultural traditions of land management, fire has created different effects on landscapes and archaeological sites. In places of thin topsoil, repeated intensive burning and subsequent erosion could deplete the ground of its ability to support further plant growth. A similar result could occur with extreme flooding and other high-energy erosional episodes. The depleted areas could be described as badlands, where the ground has been eroded down to its subsoil. You can appreciate how many transformative processes have been combined or compounded, in total affecting the shape of a ground surface and the integrity of archaeological deposits. At a certain scale, you can identify a whole sedimentary unit, acknowledging that it had formed through a long period of time and with multiple episodes and internal effects. Generally through time, sediments accumulate more downslope and layers accumulate over one another. As the shape of the ground continues to transform, people use it differently. Eventually, new shapes of landforms will create other kinds of erosive and depositional forces. When we discover an archaeological site today, we should be aware of the life history of the associated landform and how it related within a larger landscape setting. You can consider how people may have used various parts of their landscapes for their housing, for their food and natural resources, and for other purposes. Water sources, forest compositions, and soil properties were among the major factors that influenced where people could live and how they could interact with their landscapes. You could examine these settings at variable scales, looking for different kinds of spatial patterns of archaeological sites. You could ask how any particular location relates with its surrounding landforms and landscape context. Next, you should keep in mind about how all of those landforms may have changed through time. In addition to the land itself, we can think of the role of water in shaping a landscape setting. In many parts of the world, streams and rivers have constrained where people could live, and where we can find archaeological sites today. We need to remember, though, about how these streams and rivers have changed seasonally and at longer timescales. Eventually, the flow of water will erode into an underlying landform. The water always will flow downhill toward sea level, and it always will flow through its path of least resistance. More erosion will occur when the water flows in larger volume or down a steeper slope. In an area with steep mountains or hill slopes, the course of a stream or river will dissect a path along the edges of the adjacent slopes. The river will follow mostly the same path through time, given the slow rate of erosion of the adjacent hill slopes. By comparison, in an area with minimal sloped terrain, the course of a stream or river can change frequently. In an alluvial plain, fine silty sediments have accumulated in nearly flat formations with minimal degree of slope. These alluvial silts are easily eroded and transported. Due to their overall flatness, alluvial plains tend to flood frequently, leading to more meandering of a river course. Along with the change in water flow, the adjacent landforms can change in their shape. In an alluvial plain, archaeological deposits of different ages can be distributed not only vertically but also horizontally. In these cases, both the landform context and the landform history are essential for comprehending the archaeological record. Next in this presentation, we can consider a seashore as another major category of landform. Generally speaking, a seashore refers to any land that interfaces with the ocean. A seashore could involve almost any kind of geological formation. In many parts of the world, white sandy beaches were composed of the calcareous particles of broken corals and shells. Other beaches were made of dark volcanic sands, sometimes called black sand beaches. Many seashores, in fact, have been made of limestones and other rocky formations. Seashores can be highly variable through time. Even a minor change in sea level, for example, can affect an impressively large expanse of a seashore. People naturally adjust to these transformations, not only along the seashore itself, but also in the adjacent landforms. Seashores undergo constant change in many different aspects and timescales concurrently. Daily tidal processes continually modify the shape of a shoreline through variable patterns of deposition and erosion. Periodic storm surge events and other high-energy episodes can cause more extensive modifications. Change in the sea level itself can bring massive transformations of shorelines. Typically, high tides bring sand, shells, and other debris onto the shore in elongate piles, parallel with the shoreline. Eventually, those piles accumulate into berms or ridges, and many of these formations were attractive for cultural use in most parts of the world. With change in sea level, a beach berm or ridge can become stranded slightly inland or landward. Different lines of berms or ridges can occur in succession, reflecting the history of a changing sea level and shoreline. As shorelines transformed, people of course adjusted the placements of their activity areas, and they developed new patterns of using the changing resources in and around these habitats. Often, the archaeological records show different spatial arrangements through time, along with the change in seafood remains and other evidence. The coastal records can become more complicated with slope-eroded sediments that cover the seashore landforms, especially in places where people were active in the inland hills and higher terrain. Slope erosion could contribute to substantially different landscape contexts. In any landform or landscape setting, you can acknowledge how the archaeological record involves more than meets the eye on the surface today. In order to make sense of the archaeological record, you can begin with reconstructing the ancient setting and outlining how it changed chronologically. In concluding this episode, now you should be able to evaluate the past contextual settings and the long-term changing histories of landforms. You should be prepared to interpret how people used those settings in the past and adjusted with their transformations through time. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and that you will explore more with the Archaeology Studio.